Well, thank you very much for that welcome. It is great to be here in the constituency of Morley and Outwood on such a sunny day. Unemployment here is down 50%, clear evidence that our long-term economic plan is working. And in 2 weeks' time, we're going to create another job in Morley and Outwood when Andrea Jenkins becomes our excellent Member of Parliament here in this constituency. And I want to thank the team at Carlsberg for welcoming us all here today. This is probably the best venue in the world to give a speech about the British economy. Now, we are 2 weeks away from a general election in which all the participants and all the observers, for all their disagreements, do agree on one thing. There's a bigger difference on economic policy between the main parties than in any election for at least a generation. Yet despite this, these different directions of policy and the big implications for the future of our country, its level of taxation, borrowing and spending, the way it's perceived by others in the world, are being given only cursory examination. The cry goes up, well, they're all the same. None of them are telling us what they do. Yet you have an incumbent Prime Minister and Chancellor with a 5-year track record, which we're telling you is a very clear guide to what we will do in the future. And you have a Leader of the Opposition and a Shadow Chancellor telling you very clearly that they want to depart from our record rather than repeat it, and have given themselves quite openly the flexibility in their fiscal commitments to allow them to do so. In this election, there also seems to be a fatigue with big numbers. Our £30 billion of savings, their £148 billion of extra borrowing. Who knows what the real numbers are, people say. But saving £30 billion is not the same as borrowing an extra £148 billion. There's a massive difference in a country whose annual budget is £740 billion a year. Saving money means taking the difficult decisions so we reduce our debt and keep our economy out of crisis and on an even keel. And borrowing much more money involves higher national debt, higher debt interest costs, and higher taxation, either now or deferred in the future. So surely, with just 2 weeks to go to polling day, and with millions already voting by post, the public are owed a clear explanation of the real choices on offer and the consequences for their jobs, their incomes, their mortgage bills, and the stability of the British economy. I think so. Now, I am proud of what we've achieved with the British people over these last 5 years in office. We inherited a nigh on impossible economic situation with a double-digit budget deficit in the middle of a European sovereign debt crisis. And we had to deal with the threat of chronic political instability when, for the first time in at least 30 years, there was a hung parliament. But with the clear leadership from the Prime Minister, we delivered stable government against the odds that set out and stuck to and saw through a long-term economic plan. And 5 years on, what can be said about our economic plan? Well, put simply in the words last week of the Managing Director of the IMF, it worked. Our deficit, as a share of our national income, is half what it was. And the original target I set of getting our debt share falling has been met. Britain last year grew faster than any other major advanced economy in the world and is set to be one of the fastest growing in the next 2 years. Unemployment has plummeted faster and further than anyone predicted, and in marked contrast with most European economies. And instead of inactivity rising, as it has done, for example, in the United States, we now have the highest employment rate in our history. Living standards were hit harder than anyone imagined by the Great Recession. Yet now they are higher than they were 5 years ago and rising strongly. Therefore, it would be easy at this election to say, job done, no further difficult decisions are required. And that is indeed the unreal world inhabited by our political opponents. They say, let's stop pursuing this economic path that has got us this far. The country can afford to ease up, back off, and let be. Now, this morning's public finance figures show the progress we've made and what more needs to be done. For the first time, we've got the complete borrowing figures for the year just finished, 2014-15. It shows that year on year, borrowing was down by £11 billion on the year before, and indeed £3 billion lower than the independent forecast at the budget just weeks ago. So the plan is working. But the deficit, now estimated at 4.8% of national income, is clearly still too high. Productivity is too weak. We're beginning to see a national economic rebalancing, with the North growing even faster than the South, but it's only a start. So I don't stand before you saying it's all fine, there's no need to worry, the job is done. I say there's more to do. I say there's more to do to make savings in government, equivalent to £1 in every 100 we spend each year. More to do to support businesses with lower taxes, more to boost family incomes with a higher tax-free personal allowance, more to train apprentices, improve schools and help with childcare, more to build homes and invest in infrastructure, more to rebalance our economy and build a northern powerhouse. Unlike other participants in this election, we've told you when we plan to eliminate the whole deficit, the balance between tax and spending, and we've got a track record that proves it can be done. So you don't need to make wild guesses about what we would do if we were elected for another 5 years. You know we would carry on delivering the economic and fiscal plan that we have pursued over these last 5 years. You know that plan will continue to create jobs, increase living standards, reduce insecurity, and spread national prosperity, because every independent observer of the British economy thinks it will. I also believe that it's the best answer to the concerns about things like unwanted zero-hour contracts and food bank usage, for it is a dangerous fallacy to believe that you can separate the economic security of a nation from the economic security of the individuals living in that nation. When economic policy fails, as it did under the last Labour government, the poorest get hit the hardest. And when economic policy succeeds, jobs are created for the unemployed, and the nation has the resources to spend protecting the most vulnerable. And that is now happening. So when it comes to what direction our economy will be heading in on May the 8th, if there's a Conservative government, we know the answer. The same direction that it is heading in today, towards jobs, prosperity, and greater security for you and your family. So what of the alternative? What happens to that economic progress if Ed Miliband is in Downing Street? And since virtually every independent observer of British politics now says that can only happen with the votes of Scottish nationalists, what happens to economic stability if there's a Miliband SNP government? Well, first, we know that it would borrow more money. The only commitment Labour has made is to get the current budget into balance by the end of the Parliament. In other words, they claim that after 5 years, they will not be borrowing money for day-to-day spending, but they will borrow money for all the so-called capital spending, money we spend on things like buildings and equipment. Except they're not proposing to increase that capital budget by a single penny, which means they are simply giving themselves the room for more spending of borrowed money. And that means a never-ending budget deficit, Britain always spending more than it raises. Under the rules that they've set out, independent experts agree that Labour could borrow £30 billion more each and every year. The Scottish nationalists would borrow even more than Labour. The Treasury's official costings of their policy reveal the SNP would borrow £148 billion more over the Parliament. Working with Ed Miliband, it is clear that they would insist on that. Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond, the others have been very, very clear about that. As Alex Salmond says, I am writing Labour's budget. Now, he said later it was a joke, but the British people wouldn't find it funny. our national debt, which is now falling as a share of national income, would start to rise again. Our country would be getting ourselves back into the very problems we got ourselves out of. And of course, borrowing is not free. There's a debt interest charge, and on £148 billion of extra borrowing, that amounts to £6 billion extra we'll be spending in the next Parliament just to service the additional debt. When people talk about cuts in this election and the choices they face, how about the choices you have to make to afford £6 billion in extra debt interest charges to Britain's creditors around the world? Borrowing now means taxation later. And that brings me to the second observation about the Miliband SNP economic policy. Time and again, Ed Miliband and Ed Balls have told us there will be higher taxes under Labour. But when asked to give examples, they only ever produce examples of taxes on the very richest people and the most expensive houses. The problem is that not only have they already spent most of the proceeds on various new spending plans, but also it is simply not possible to raise the sums Labour needs by just taxing the bankers and the city and the mansions. I know, I have taxed all three. And you might raise £1 billion, maybe £2 billion more than we have, but it doesn't, of course, take into account the billions you might lose in lost investment in our country. After all, it was Ed Balls, not me, who said that one of their tax plans, abolishing the non-dom status, could actually cost the country money. But let's for a moment leave that argument about lost investment to one side. £2 billion is nowhere near the kind of scale of tax revenues that Labour needs to raise.